Good evening, everyone. It is your girl, Marcy Thomas, coming to you for another episode of the BGC Book Club. So as you're coming on in the space, please feel free to let us know where you're joining us from. If it's your first time here, or, if you're here only because of the guests, because you've seen them in other spaces and decided you wanted to come and hear what all this conversation is about, just let us know who's here, because we love to have an interactive experience. So for those of you who may not know, of course, I am the founder of Brown Girl Collective and BGC Book Club, which actually this month is BGC Book Club's 3rd year anniversary. So I'm really excited about that. For the last 3 years since the pandemic, I have been coming to you all to talk to you about wonderful books and authors, and just have these experiences where we can come together and have really important conversations. And of course, tonight is no exception. So I'm not going to belabor it. Oh, well, I didn't say where I'm coming to you from. I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio, currently coming to you from the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia. So it is wonderful to be here in the Peach State, coming to you and broadcasting around the world. So tonight I'm excited about a very special book that we will be talking about. It's a little different, because if you're normally here for something fiction or memoir, tonight is not that, but it is a real talk, literally, kind of conversation that we need to have. And the book we'll be discussing is Real Friends Talk About Race. And it's bridging the gaps through uncomfortable conversations, which, oftentimes those conversations can be. So our authors are Yseult P. Mukantabana, who is Rwandan, Jewish, and queer. She is a fashion designer and art social advocate. She sits on the board of POW Arts and is an expert research fellow at the Tel Aviv Institute. Our second guest is Hannah Summerhill, who is a white Jewish woman from Pennsylvania. She's had a long career in magazines, working in advertising sales at places like Vogue, Cosmopolitan, and Women's Health. And she's written for brands like Elle.com, New York Magazine, and Refinery 29. She's on the board of her city's Equality Coalition and plays guitar in her free time. And the two of them together are the hosts of the Kinswomen podcast, and they run a lot of courses that help people to learn how to navigate, once again, these difficult conversations. So without any further delay, let's welcome Yseult and Hannah. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Marcy.
Hi.
Thank you.
Hi. Yes, it is so wonderful. I was telling you beforehand, it's wonderful to have you all here so that we can have this very, very important conversation. So I guess, well, number one, congratulations. Your book, baby, is not even a week old yet.
Yeah, thank you.
So how does that feel?
It's surreal.
Yeah, it's a long time coming.
Yeah.
Like it feels good that it's out, and I personally am excited to hear what people think about it, what it triggers in them. So it's going to be the exciting for me.
All right. Well, that's good. And first time author, book for both of you?
Yes.
Wow, that's great. That's great. So, I know it's two of you, so in order to there not be confusion, I may direct the question directly. So I want to ask you, Hannah, how did you all first connect?
Yseult and I met at a co-working space in New York where we both used to live, and that was in January of 2019. I had attended an event called Bridging the Empathy Gaps Between Women of Color and White Women. And it was this fishbowl event where women, anyone who wanted to speak, could sit in this center circle of chairs, and then an audience surrounded them. So you had to get up to speak and sit in the center of chairs if you wanted to talk. And Yseult got up and she basically said, like, why are the white women who are here not part of this conversation? And I realized that I was one of those women who was sitting quietly in the back, really there's more of a voyeur than a participant. And after the event was over, I felt like we barely scratched the surface. Like, clearly there was so much more to say, but the event had like an hour and a half time limit. So some of the women from that event and I got together and we said, let's continue having these dialogues. I was like, I'll have them at my apartment. And none of those women ended up showing up eventually to those evenings. But I ran into Yseult a couple weeks later and I said, hey, I was at that event where you spoke. I would love to have you over. Some of us are going to continue this dialogue and get together. And I brought friends from work, and Yseult came and attended. And that's how we started the whole Kinswomen journey, because the living room dialogues then led to a podcast, which led to a book. And now we're here.
All right. So, Yseult, what was it in that experience that made you decide to speak out and say, hey, wait a minute, all of y'all are here, but you're not saying anything?
Yeah, I mean, it was like the classic type of dynamic where white people think that when we talk about racism, they're not involved, and they're not personally involved, and it's kind of like a societal issue. And it was basically playing it out in real life where everyone that was coming into the fishbowl were women that had to take on emotionally and share vulnerable stories. And the majority of the people in the room were women. And so it felt very, very voyeuristic. And I don't believe in having to tell my pain in order to explain what racism is, or to give example what racism is. I don't have to show what I've experienced personally. And it felt like we were really sitting there watching people share their very vulnerable stories to people that they were spectators, and it felt very voyeuristic, and it felt icky. And so instead of me participating and like sharing another story, I just called out the obvious, where it's like, this is supposed to be a bridging the gap, but it just feels like once again the minority is like sharing very sad stories that the majority doesn't seem to connect with, or feel bad, but they'll move on to the next thing, go to dinner, and and move on with their life. And I was absolutely against that, and I want to feed into it, so I called it out.
And good to you. Kudos to you for doing that, because I think that a lot of times, we do go through things, and when we do share, it's like we don't feel like we'll be heard. But then we also know that there's another side to things as well. And, being able to hear the other side and, help everyone to kind of come to a level of understanding of what's really going on, that just makes a difference. And I think it makes for better, relationships and things like that, to be able to have open and honest communication. So, of course, the two of you all had just met each other. So how was the navigating a new relationship, talking about things that are so difficult, or can be so difficult or challenging?
Well, I thought it was really interesting that she started that at home. I left for a few months. I was traveling, and I continued to receive emails that showed that she continued doing it. And, I had little faith in like someone that I didn't know. And I was like, okay, well, it's great that you're starting this conversation in your living room. I don't know if it's like, I didn't know. I didn't expect anything, but it seemed she had continued. I had left the country for a few months. And when I came back, I reached out and said, hey, like, let's make this a thing, and like maybe sit down and bridge the gap by diversifying the stories that we know of women of color, and not based in horror and pain, and more like humanizing them. And so that's how we basically got together. The co-working space that we both remember had a podcast room, and so that's where we started. I contacted a friend, and like it just started really like spontaneously, just to bring things on a bigger space, and like just like reach more people, and kind of have a more interactive kind of conversation in regard to the conversation that Hannah had started already in her living room.
All right. And Hannah, I guess, was this something that you always did naturally, or was this something that you came into this work, or being open to having these conversations?
For me, my white lens kind of started to come off when I met my husband 10 years ago, who was a Black man. And we would just be having what I thought were normal, everyday experiences, getting a cab, walking down the street, going into a restaurant in New York. And I would recognize how different these everyday, what I saw as like benign experiences would be, and how differently people treated him than me. So that was when I grew up raised by white parents who would consider themselves like liberal and open-minded, and that meant to them colorblind, like, oh, we don't see color. And I didn't realize at the time when I was being raised how like naive and privileged that was, and just how erasing that was. So meeting my husband, then boyfriend 10 years ago, like we would have these experiences, and then finally like we would start to talk about his experience versus mine. And that's when I started to get really interested in learning more, unlearning, re-educating myself, because I just felt it was not fair. And that just kind of started to slowly peel back the layers. And so I'd been working with my company. I worked in corporate America for a long time and saw a lot of issues there, but I didn't necessarily like, I was having these deep conversations with my husband, but they were from a male perspective. And I'm such a woman's woman, and I know that, you know, there's the intersection of being female and Black, or, you know, we existed within so many intersections. So I wanted to talk to women specifically about these dialogues and conversations, and that's why I dove into Kinswomen.
And you said something there, because it is a different experience. It is a different experience for a Black woman. You know, you talk about corporate America, there's a part of me that just shudders because I'm not in corporate space anymore. But, you know, years of being in corporate spaces and just seeing, you know, how as a Black woman being treated, not necessarily having the same types of opportunities others would have, or, you know, could be doing, like they always say, you got to work twice as hard to get half as much. And there is some truth to that, you know. But then also in those spaces, sometimes seeing the insensitivity of some of the white women when things were going on that were specific to the Black community, for example. Oh, is that something that you've seen in your work world as well, or?
Yeah, I think that like on my part, the reason why I wanted to have this conversation, focusing on white women, is because like historically speaking in America, white women have been like a strong help on white supremacy, and I think that like they've been portrayed as like these like innocent beings that are just like victim of patriarchy, which is true, but also benefit from whiteness because they're white. And so that's the intersectional space that white women exist. And so I wanted to address that. Like I wanted to speak on that and to make white women accountable for like the historical involvement of their like existence within white supremacy, and also like addressing it, how they've internalized, how passively or non-passively have helped within white supremacist like ideology in America and outside. And so that's why I wanted to have a conversation with white women. I didn't want it to make it seem like it's a bad white man. It's like, no, white women have been like very much in who with everything that happened, and they've been like in so many instances like small things that feels that we overlook or like we haven't addressed, you know, that are so dangerous and that have marked the kind of the racial dynamic that exists until today. So that's why I wanted to have that conversation and to try to address and also give responsibility and accountability to white women in that conversation.
Yeah, and there are so many, like we were talking about before, there are 13 chapters, so there's no way we can touch on everything in that. But one of the things that stood out to me, I'm trying to find the page, is because it's in one of the four foundations. So oftentimes when we're trying to have relationships or really have open friendships, because I mean, let me just tell you a little bit about me. real quick. I grew up, as I mentioned earlier, I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. My first few years of school, I was in like a Black world, going to Black schools, all of that. Then by the time I went to third grade, I spent like 3 months in a school. I was the only Black child. So that was a different experience. And then I went to a school, actually, that was in a neighborhood that was largely Jewish. So I know a lot about some of the Jewish celebrations and things like that because they were a part of the school, but it was more of a mixture. And I really remember having different friends and all of that. And at a certain point, it's like people started to go into their own groups because I guess people go where they feel more comfortable.
Yeah.
So as we got older, I saw the shift. But then, as an adult and then going into workspaces that have a variety of people, the relationships oftentimes resurface and not really where we would get into deep conversations or, we'll hang out at work and go to lunch, but we don't hang out outside of that.
Yeah.
So it's like different worlds.
Yeah.
So the one thing I like you talk about, a lot of that's trust is what I was getting to. And you talk about how it's easy, what are the ways that people can begin to develop trust, and it starts with 4 foundations. So you can talk about those, what those mean.
Yeah, so for white people in general, and I include myself in this, if we put ourselves in like the liberal open-minded camp, we're like, oh, people of color should trust us because we're good people, right? We voted for Obama and we have a sign on our lawn that says, in this home we believe that all are welcome, or whatever that that sign is that's everywhere in the suburbs. But we ignore the context, we ignore our own responsibility, and we ignore historical context. And our work is so much about the interpersonal interactions that happen at work between friends, between partners, and even in between family members too. And we wanted to write a framework that for white people to recognize that trust is something like any other relationship that's built over time, but it's something where ridiculously, like with the groups that we have subordinated and stolen from and what's the word, like marginalized, disenfranchised for hundreds and hundreds of years, we expect trust from those groups. And that's like a kind of like white supremacist, white superiority, very inherent to whiteness. So the 4 foundations that we talk about are time, transparency, consistency, and communication. Just like any other friendship, like or romantic relationship, you don't instantly trust that person, but it's almost this presumptuousness that comes with whiteness. So we break it down in those 4 things to try to let our readers understand how important they are and understand the gravity and the time and the patience that it takes to build trust cross-racially.
And it's also, I think, like interpersonal relationship, it's like when you're friends with someone, you naturally just see the person. Like you just want to see the person, you just want to love the person. And in reality, we come with our own baggages. We come with our own story. And white people come with their own baggages. And it doesn't seem like, because historically, like in different artifacts, white people are seen as like supposedly the safe space. It's just not the truth for us. It's not true for me. I don't presume that you're a white person, you're a safer person. And I think that a lot of people, Black people, people of color, feel the same way. And so because of that, it makes it obvious that we have to install kind of like guidelines in order to have healthy relationships, which feels really obvious, but it's not as obvious because it doesn't come up naturally in relationships, or people feel very uncomfortable bringing it up because they're like, well, if I bring it up, then they're gonna feel like I'm not a good friend, or I don't really like them. But it's important to talk about it. those answers are not going to define the rest of the relationship, but at least it creates some type of a foundation on which the relationship is able to exist. And I think it's the starter kit to like just check in for yourself if you're not setting yourself up for awkward relationship with someone that might be really nice, but doesn't meet the standards of like the environment that you want it to exist in. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it is important because, as I was thinking about a very specific friend of mine that I used to work with. I mean, we were really close at work. And, we spent a lot of time talking and, hanging out, and like she would travel and I would I would go to her house and stay there and take care of her cats and all that kind of stuff while she was away. And, and we're still cool. We haven't worked together in several years, but one of the things is that as close as we were at work, I remember a couple of times she invited me to hang with her and some of her other friends. And I knew that her other friend group didn't look like me. There was really nobody in that friend group that looked like me. Even though she grew up, around Black people. A lot of time, now mind you, this is in South Georgia. So, I mean, some things, it kind of is what it is based upon where you are. But she would invite me and I would always refuse. But what I never said to her was that I didn't want to go because I didn't feel comfortable, because even though she and I were cool, I didn't know what kind of situation I was potentially walking into with her friends.
Mm. You said that to the person?
No, I did not.
Oh, okay.
I would have, had that conversation with her, just to say, hey, I'm not sure,
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that's the thing, just about having a quote unquote real conversation.
Right.
Yeah, 100%.
Right.
So in the work that you all do, are those the kinds of things that you kind of coach people through, being able to have those kinds of conversations?
Yeah, I think it's really important to be open about these conversations. On an interpersonal level, it's up to the type of relationship that we have with this person. And it's but we should be forward about things that feels important always. Even if it feels like it's going to create friction, at least on the long term, you're comfortable. I personally apply these things for myself. I cannot be friends with people that I can't have full conversation with about all sides of my identity. That's just not possible. Right. Oh, I don't feel comfortable talking about the fact that I'm gay. I'm not going to be friends with you. Or oh, you might be coming from a place where there's a lot of homophobic, people around you. I don't want to be around that. Even if you're a great person, if you still decide to be around these people, it means that there's similarities. There's maybe something that you need to address with yourself that I'm not going to trust you 100%. But that's just me. And I think everyone has their own journey in regards to these relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know. And it also, of course, goes into not just friendships. We talk about, interracial dating and marriage and all of that. These are things that come up. Of course, Hannah, you can maybe speak a little bit to that piece of it as well, that, we have people who fall in love and you love who you love. Yeah. But sometimes the people around you might have different feelings about it.
Yeah. I mean, I really wish love was enough in an interracial relationship. I just don't think that it is, unfortunately. I think that, like Yseult said, there's a honeymoon period in the beginning. Sometimes you don't want to talk about, the elephants in the room sometimes. And I think for me in my relationship for the first couple of years, that was definitely the case. And then it just got to the point where it couldn't be ignored. And I know that a lot of people lean on love and say, well, I don't see color. I just love, my partner. And I think that's beautiful. But the world responds to both of you so differently in a relationship, no matter what your identity is. But that's something that needs to be acknowledged. And then, of course, if you decide to have children, there's a massive responsibility, I think, on the white partner specifically, to do the work of raising a child of color in the world. But it impacts every decision that we make, you know, where we vacation, where we shop, the things that we go and do. I mean, just recently, my husband was home with me in Pennsylvania, and I live in a neighborhood that, well, my parents live in a neighborhood. We were visiting my parents, and they live in a neighborhood that everyone would consider very safe. But my husband didn't want to walk around the neighborhood by himself because these are all white people in like rural Pennsylvania who've never seen him walk around before. So he's not going to take that risk. And I think like it's important that my family understands that, and it's important that the things that I see as very safe and every day are not the case for him. But I think no matter what the identities of your partner is, you just need to take into consideration that, yeah, the world, like while you may have pure love, like the world outside isn't necessarily going to give your partner all the love and respect and the, you know, the level of healthcare, the salary that they deserve. I mean, it's everything. And then of course there's the impact of generational trauma, epigenetics, like what's being passed down that we're living with, you know, and the systems that we're living within. So it's great to be in the little love bubble, but like we can't pretend like the outside world, you know, and the inside world doesn't impact our interracial relationships.
Right.
But if I can add on it, it's like I grew up within an interracial family as well. My father's white, Belgian, my mother's African, Burundian, Rwandan, and I dated people that are white. And I think that like the false idea around interracial relationship is that the threat is always from the outside. That the issue is always from the world. And the reality is that you're going to find yourself in very weird situations within the relationship. And like, that's why I want the book to have people wonder, like, how are you as a white person in this dynamic of an interracial relationship? As a person of color, have you asked them the right questions? Have you like had these uncomfortable conversations? Because like as of now, we've always been told that the outside world attacks a union that loves each other, which is like true, but it's also within the relationship. There's things that come up that have to be addressed. Like I think that like I have so many friends that like had marriages, children, divorced, separated because things between them was just too, things were never talked about. Like the racial dynamic was never spoken. It's like, where do the kids go to school? Where do you live? Like, what languages are they learning? Are you actually sharing 50-50? What does 50-50 look like? Does it mean that one takes over the other one? Because in reality, there is these dynamics that are true and they have to be addressed. And so it's like, that's what I really would love for people to look into, because then you set yourself to a healthier relationship with your partner because you do love each other. That's the base. And then it's like building on something that feels actually equal and not just like, oh, 50-50, but then like you realize that the kids don't know nothing about one side of the parent. Like, and you talk to them and they're like, well, you know, I grew up, whatever. And it's just like, but what does that mean? Does that mean that you know, it's, we do it like instinctively, maybe sometimes just to make things easier, but it's like the successful 50-50 means the kids are actually in touch with both sides equally. Right. And that doesn't look always like that for everyone, but knowing why is really important.
Right. One of the things I like, Hannah, just to say, the way that the book is written, it's basically you hear both voices. So Yseult has places where she's writing and you can tell by the font, and then the other places for Hannah. So I like the way that you all did that. Obviously, it was intentional for you both to tell the story or tell your stories, talk about your experiences using your own voice versus, you know, a lot of books when people write together, it's like everything's all together. Yeah. But the two of you have your own distinctive experiences and voice.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was so important to us because, well, on our podcast, we have two different voices and we're just very different people. We actually had a woman at our book event last week. She was like, you two don't make sense to me. Like, how did this happen? You guys are so different. And it's true, we are, but I think that's what makes the conversation so interesting between us. But having our both like unique, distinctive voices was really important. Also, I would never want, and like there have been instances in the past where Yseult's called me in on this, where, you know, because we teach a lot of the same stuff over and over again, attributing like her intellectual property to her, attributing what I've learned from her in the course of our partnership together as friends, podcasters, business owners together, that it's really important that people know like what I've learned from her and our partnership, and that it isn't just like coming from like, you know, me, because everything that I was able to write about in this book, I have learned from other people like outside of myself, BIPOC educators, authors, writers, friends, family, and Yseult, of course, too. So it was super important to us that we both wrote in the first person. And I also just wanted to be like super vulnerable with like ways that I've messed up, like what Yseult just said about the harm happening within the relationship. I talk about an instance where even though in my town I'm working with the police force on de-escalation policies, and I'm working on a police like oversight commission, Dave called me, my husband called me out in a moment where he felt I was policing him. And I think that it's just so important that as white people, yeah, we can like be doing these outwardly like good things, right? But in my own relationship, if my husband is feeling like I'm like controlling him in any way or taking away his agency or freedom, then I'm not doing my job as an aspiring ally to him. You know, like I can be checking all of the boxes outside of myself, but the relationship, and I'm so grateful because he can tell me, like he won't like push it under the rug. Like he can like straight up tell me to my face, you're really leaning on your white privilege right now, or this is such a privileged thing for you to say, or I feel like you're policing me, or etc. And yeah, those conversations are completely uncomfortable and make me feel like I've failed, but they are so necessary to have.
One thing, you said something there that you talk about a lot in the book, because we hear the terminology of being an ally, and you just said aspiring ally. So what is an aspiring ally?
We like to say that there's no endpoint or graduation to being an ally. Like Yseult has said, there's no badge that you get when you know, are deemed an ally, as if it's like this always and forever permanent thing. So I like to say aspiring, because there's just no, like, there's no perfect ally. Allyship means something to every individual at different points in their day almost, you know, and it's so specific to the person. So I think getting away from this idea that we'll be this perfect woke white ally is such a myth, because then we stop taking action, we stop learning and unlearning. So I think the aspiring just helps remind people that it's an ongoing, forever journey.
Right. That it is. Now, Yseult, of course, you know, as a Black woman, oftentimes, you know, we are expected to, you already said it, to kind of do all the heavy lifting in terms of, you know, sharing information and teaching people and telling people. How important is that how important is it for us to maintain our sense of agency, to not do that, to practice self-care by not always doing that?
No, I think that like I make it clear in the book, and you know, when we talk about even allyship, early on when the podcast became really like popular and people were inviting us to have a conversation in regards to the podcast, I had explained how I'm so annoyed by the intellectual laziness when it comes to, you know, allyship conversation from white people. It's like they want to give themselves a badge when they haven't proven anything. And it comes from the fact that like they believe that they're a good person, which I'm sure they are, but being an ally means to be in action with your belief and not just belief. It's not just like believing that you're a good person, but it's like putting into action. So like early on, we had a conversation in an interview, and I said that like white people don't get to say that they're allies until we say that they're allies. And that's why we came with the idea of like, as aspiring allies, because until we as BIPOC decide that you are an ally, you cannot claim it for yourself, because we're going to have to feel it goes back to the trust, and it goes back to building the trust and building becoming accountable for your action in regards to like what you say you believe in. And so for me, it's really important to not place my story as being like the main focal point for white people to do their work. And so it's more about like shifting the way we've been talking about this, as saying like we have to like talk about our pain so that they care. It hasn't worked. We've talked about how much we are in pain. We know the statistics. We see the images. We're put on display all the times in regards to the harm that's done to us, and it doesn't change anything. So I care about like shifting the conversation and redirecting what is appropriate, which is like accountability from white people and real action. And until then, it just feels performative and it's not really real. And it's a forever ongoing action, rather than like, okay, you know, I've done enough, now can I move on? And a lot of the times that's what white people do, because they get to move on. We don't get to. We have to juggle knowing what we experience it constantly, and also finding space to exist outside that. And for me, the book wasn't about me talking about how I am in pain so I can convince white people to want to bridge the gap, but it's more like these ideologies that are so painful to minorities have done something to y'all, to white people. It has affected you in the way you are as people in this world. And so like you have to restore that humanity that is like taken out from these ideology. And so that means like learning, applying your learning, being an active member of society where you reinstall that like basically humanity for others, you know. And that's why a lot of the times you're like, man, all of this is happening, do they not? It's like, but the space that we exist in just doesn't it doesn't make it obvious that this should feel for us, because that's just not how things are set up. So it's more restoring something in them and turning the mirror to themselves, rather than looking up to us to talk about how painful it is for us, so that maybe they would feel something. That's how I approach the book. But I exist outside these conversations for sure. And I think, yeah, and it's because that's just not my whole reality. It's just part of my reality. And I think that's what's so beautiful about BIPOC people, that we exist within these dynamic and we thrive out, like in the midst of this, we thrive. And like that is something that is just phenomenal. Like I find it amazing, and it's another conversation to have within the community of like, how do we exist and how do we like cope with everything that we have to deal with, and also get to like evolve as human beings without having to think about this thing that we shouldn't be the ones dealing with. They should be the ones like addressing and fix, you know.
Right. And that's true, because we do experience a lot of Black joy. It's not always trauma and pain and negativity. You know, there is that space for that, and we do need to experience that apart from all of this. Because something that I oftentimes think about is that we as Black people can have a world that we exist in, and we're over here doing our thing, but there's a part of us that always has to interact. So that's where these conversations become important, wherein a lot of cases with white people, they don't exist in a world where they're really dealing with Black people. If it's somebody, especially in the middle of North Dakota or Iowa or somewhere, they're not dealing with Black people at all, really. But it's still important for them to understand these things, because they impact all of humanity. So, Hannah, for you, I know you have done a lot of reading and a lot of study. You're not putting it, all on, people like Yseult to be the ones to do the heavy lifting for you. So what has that process been like for you, just to go and learn for yourself?
Oh my goodness. I mean, being on this journey has just changed my entire perspective of all of our systems, how our education system works, our healthcare system, our justice system, capitalism, educating myself about the history that I didn't learn in school, learning about, the leaders and the heroes of the civil rights movement, Black inventors, just, everything that has been hid and suppressed by white supremacy that should be part of our upbringing, no matter who we are. Like we ignore our own American history. So the beginning of my journey was like just a lot of anger and shame. Like anger, why didn't I know this? Shame, why am I learning this at this age? And then it's like, okay, what do I do about this? But it's taken, it takes a while for me. I'm a big reader. That's how I like integrate things. I like to just sit with things, and like my time away from a screen is like very precious. So I do love watching documentaries and listening to podcasts too. But for me, reading is really where it seeps in, and it's just changed my perspective on everything. Like I said, and I treat it like a re-education. Like I'm going back to school, and I set aside time every day, which it might seem like robotic to some people, but it's just like, well, you went to school every day until how old? And you learned all this very white-centered, white-focused stuff filtered through a white lens. It takes time to decondition. So yeah, it's just changed my whole life. I mean, I'm really involved in local politics now in my city, and I don't think I would have a lot of context for why things are the way they are if I hadn't read books about the Great Migration, about how Jim Crow impacts, Jim Crow led to the prison pipeline and the war on drugs, or if I hadn't read about redlining and restrictive covenants and, the way that highways were built through Black neighborhoods. Like having context for me has just been everything, because so often like when white people are in conversation and we hear something that another white person has said and we know it's problematic, but we don't know how to interrupt it because we just truly we can't articulate why. We don't have like the context, the history. We know it's wrong because it feels wrong, hopefully, but there's nothing that we can say in that moment because we just don't have the words. Education for me has really helped me articulate, like be able to see why somebody would think that or perpetuate a stereotype, and then hopefully give people, the story as to why that's not true. So it's so important for every white person. Like, don't just read our book too, like read as much as you can. We have a resource list in the back of the book. Mm-hmm. We source everything, and learn as much as you can. We talk about diversifying your social media feeds, like books to read, things to watch, just ways to decenter whiteness from your life, I think is just so, so key to being on the allyship journey.
Yes, it is important. It is important. So you talk about a lot in this book. One of the other things a term that we hear a lot is cultural appropriation. And it's not just necessarily like these beautiful braids that I have. It shows up in a lot of different ways. But Yseult, talk a little bit about that, or, how you all kind of frame it in the book and the whole thing of cultural appropriation, because different people have different takes on what that actually means. And, they might think that, it's appreciation. So, just talk a little bit about that.
I think the appreciation is when you put like a source to what you're doing. Like you say, this is from this person, this is from this culture, you recognize it, you even like pay for it. Appropriation is like theft. It's you're taking something for yourself, you're rebranding it under names that you feel comfortable with, but then like for people that have known this in their own cultural context, they know what this is. It's not new. It's just new to white people. And so I think that like with social media, with the internet, and the fact that we're all like internationally connected, we have access to different culture. We have access to different like practices, but just like white supremacy doesn't have an attitude to appreciate. It has an attitude to appropriate and to steal from other cultures. Even within like BIPOC cultures, we do do like take from each other or like have influence with each other, but it's just not in the same spirit of like, you know, you see like a business that went somewhere in Asia or somewhere in India or somewhere in Africa or South America. They've taken something from a culture and they've made so much money without putting context, cultural context to it, without like giving back to the community. Like that is theft. That is like appropriation. And I think it shows itself very much in like social media, because there's trends, because there's things that like work and people want to like, you know, wear their hair a certain way, they want to put the skin a certain way, and the kind of like the most obvious part of what cultural appropriation is when the people where this said practice comes from do it, they are reprimanded for it.
Mm-hmm.
But then like when white people do it, then it's like very much like, oh, it's so cool, it's exotic, it's like it's new. But then like from the people from which it's naturally there or they naturally do it, it's like seen as, oh, this is like, you know, it's not valued as good or as beautiful or as like with a value. So that's where you feel like something is not right, and it's basically white supremacy playing a role in how we're dealing with the world becoming more and more globalized, basically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's true. Hannah, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I name them in the book, but I point to the Kardashians as a good example of how to distinguish, because I think it's hard for white people, because they're like, yeah, if I'm not racist, how is this appropriation if I wear braids, you know? But like Yseult said, when white people take, again, you know, as we have for the past 400 years, and wear something that's ours when the same people are getting punished for it, or denied pay or denied hiring, or, you know, being kicked off their sports team for it, then you can't really call it appreciation. Like if you're doing the same thing that where you're getting celebrated and those to whom it's natural are getting punished, it seems very clear to me that it's not a practice that we should be engaging in. And I think a term that's been popularized via Instagram has been this term blackfishing, and it's credited to a journalist named Juana Thompson several years ago. But it's when white women or non-Black women of color appropriate the styles, hairstyle, features, makeup of Black women and profit off of it. And we've seen the Kardashians excel at it and make billions of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes people point to their proximity to Blackness and like say that that's okay for them to do that. But it happens on social media. It happens in during Halloween is a big one. Even saying things like bride tribe. Like I've seen things like white women should not be using Native words like tribe for everything, or saying like powwow. There are just ways like it shows up in our language, and it's not to like nitpick and police people's language and distract from the larger what's really at hand. But when you do have that context, you can just recognize that it's just one more example of the way that we're like white supremacy just takes everything from BIPOC culture.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that like on an interpersonal level and allyship, I think that if white people in general would see that injustice come up and they would speak on it and they would call it out and say like, oh, but it was cool for me, like why isn't it cool for her or for them, that would feel okay. It would be like, okay, we could share, but the what makes it worse is that when things unjust come up like this, where it's like, I remember there's like a celebrity, I don't remember her name, she did dreads, she did like full dreads, and she was someone, a presenter said that it looked like it smelled a certain way, like
Zendaya.
Yeah. And then one of the Kardashian had done the same hairstyle, and it was like, oh my God, it's so pretty, da da da. There was no comments done to kind of like step up and say, oh, but why are you, you know, even they have social media, they have Twitter and they have Instagram, like even on a personal level, just say like, that's weird. Like, why did you guys call her out for looking unprofessional, and why are you praising me? It's like, that's what it is to take it back to yourself. And how are you participating and maintaining these dynamics? Because if you don't call it out when it's happening, then you're just feeding into like a problematic system. And so you're part of the problem. And you cannot come to me and say, I'm a nice person. Well, okay, but why didn't you say something? Say, oh, why did you like call her out and say that was unprofessional? And it was totally professional with me, and it was beautiful, and it was cool. That's where people have to take accountability. White people have to take accountability and being able to place themselves in the space of like calling it out and say, okay, that's weird, and not necessarily having the solution, but being able to say, okay, that's a strange situation. And it's not like they have to figure it out, because like we're all online and there's Black Twitter that calls it out. So they're doing the work for you. You just have to like retweet and say, I support this message. And literally you become like, oh, we're cool with you.
You're invited to the cookout.
What I mean? And then if you don't say nothing, you're just part of the problem, and you're comfortable, her getting her hand. And it goes to the idea that like in general, white people feel like they're going to get punished for standing up, which we have shown that they don't. Like with the politician recently, with the white woman not being punished and the 2 Black men being punished, it is a clear example of like, you're not going to get in trouble. Like nothing is going to happen. And if you do, you can find another job. You're going to get paid better. It's not going to have a real, how do you say, like, it's not going to have a real effect, actually. So that's why I make it such an important point to say this is an interpersonal take on racism, because it makes people feel more responsible and make them more accountable for how they're acting, not societal issues, not what the world says, but, how are you as an individual? Are you cool or you're not? And like, it's very simple to know if you are, if you're not, not perfect either. Just, are you doing the simple stuff,
Right. And that just made me think about the fact, kind of like you said, everything starts with individuals. And if enough individuals start making the right types of action and, voting and being involved with the individuals, eventually we can see some change. But Hannah, that just makes me think the whole thing of saying something, of speaking out. I know that can sometimes be challenging because people feel like, oh, folks, my own people aren't going to like me if I say something. Or, if I'm at the family dinner and somebody makes a racist comment or tells a racist joke, if I say to them, hey, that's not cool, you shouldn't say that. But how important is it for white people and other allies or aspiring allies to actually speak up and say something when they see something is wrong?
It's like the ultimate responsibility for us. And there does not need to be, people of color in our environment for us to speak up. I mean, we need to be having these conversations in the mostly white spaces that white people exist in all the time. Like I said before, I think sometimes it can be hard as a white person to have like the tools to speak up because we don't necessarily know why something's wrong. And I think in the book, we help hopefully strengthen white readers' allyship antennas, as I like to call them, because it is a process, but it's going to feel super uncomfortable in the beginning. And I think that's why most people don't speak up, even when they do know it's wrong. And a lot of people do have the words. Like, we do have the capacity to interrupt this when we see it. Maybe we're not seeing, the nuance at first, but with time it comes. And Yseult always says discomfort doesn't kill. And I think as white people, we misinterpret discomfort to mean it's a threat. And it's not. It's just our discomfort. And yeah, it's not going to be easy to speak up to your family member, boss, friends. I've had those conversations and they are so, like, they feel so scary. I get hot, I get shaky, I get sweaty. I do feel like I'm going to like pass out a little bit, but I know that actually I'm going to survive this and it's going to be fine. And for me to have integrity with myself and the work that I do, like, who am I if I'm not, speaking up about this? And so many people who are going to read the book, if they're white, are going to put themselves in like the good white person category. And as Yseult said, we're sure that they're good people. I think picking up the book is like, a sign that they are. Mm-hmm. However, it's not just an ideology. Like, allyship requires action. So yeah, speaking up might be messy. I know at first I would get really angry. Like, I'd be like, you said this, that you're not supposed to say this word, or, my approach was like pretty rude, because I kind of took this stance at the beginning of like, I'm learning all this stuff and like, you should know better and I know better than you. And of course that does not help bring people into the conversation. So you really have to, it really depends on who it is. Like with my mom, for instance, like I know her, I know what's going to make her triggered. I know what's going to make her defensive. Same with my dad, like same with my close friends. So at first, instead of shaming that, like I would shame them at first, thinking that would bring them into the dialogue, which of course it wouldn't. And now I'm like, okay, I can recommend things in languages that I know that they'll understand. Like my mom really loves to read. I'll give her a book, or I'll just, approach it more from like a place of inquiry and curiosity. Like, oh, why do you think that? Can I share you like what we talk about in Kinswomen? Can I share with you a book that I read? And that's kind of the avenue that I take. But it really depends on the person. It will feel risky too for white people, but it's like that risk is really like, we're not risking a whole lot. We're really just risking our comfort, even if we're speaking up to the boss. Like we have HR on our side usually, so it is our responsibility to speak up when we say things.
Absolutely. Speak up to say something, because oftentimes, the people in many instances who have the power are more likely to listen than maybe say, if I was to say it, or Yseult is to say it, they'll be, oh, here we go complaining again. They're always complaining. Yeah. Everything's not racist. And that's one of the things you talk about in the book as well, that if the person feels like it was racist, if they felt that, then acknowledge that that's what they felt. Don't try to tell them what to feel or how not to feel.
Yeah, and I think that like, what Hannah is explaining, the way she's going about having this conversation with her friends and her family, this doesn't apply. I don't think it applies. The same tactics of like wanting to take time doesn't necessarily apply for like as BIPOC. If we don't feel like we have the bandwidth to have this conversation, if we don't want to talk about this, I think that we need to be okay with that as well. Because like, we don't have to be the person that's like the great like teacher or the great like the person that understands everything. We don't have to. Like, I really like, as much as like I'm like, oh, let's bridge the gap, I'm also very like, if you don't have the bandwidth to have this conversation, if you feel like this friendship has run its course, that is totally okay. And welcoming that grief on both ends is something that has to be absolutely normalized, because we come with our baggage, and there's like a threshold that we have where we're okay with certain things until it's not okay. And that's also should be normalized. It should be okay, because for a long time we were taught that like, oh, we absolutely have to get along, we absolutely have to, and sometimes it just doesn't work out, and that's okay too.
Right. And one of the things I also wanted to just let people know, yes, we are talking to a Black woman and a white woman, and we're framing it in the context of that. But the reality of it is this applies across the board, whether we're talking about our Jewish brothers and sisters, or our Asian brothers and sisters, or Native, brothers and sisters, and even, people that are a part of the LGBTQIA+. I have to get them all out. Those people as well, because the reality of it is that when one group is being attacked, it tends to spiral over into other groups as well. So yes, just for us to be mindful of the things that we're saying, the conversations that we're having, the things that we're allowing to be said in our presence, that we just let it go. All of that. I think that is important. So can you believe it? Our time is up, ladies. Wow. Yeah, the hour went by. Yes. I mean, there's a lot we didn't even talk about, which is, I guess, is good, because the whole point is to get people to read the book. So just tell us a little bit. Of course, we know you were on CBS this morning last week, and that are there any other like national places that we can look to see you in the days ahead, or?
Yes, I mean, let's speak it into existence. We want this message to reach as many people as possible. We do have a lot of radio interviews coming up, podcast interviews. So far, we were really looking forward to this. Of course, Marcy, thank you so much for having us on. But we will update everybody on our Instagram, which is scrolling here at the bottom. And we just would love to hear people's feedback, honestly, about this book. We spent almost 3 years writing it together, and it's been 4 years as the Kinswomen. So really proud of everything that we've put into this. And I just want to thank you, Marcy, and thank Yseult and everyone who's been listening.
Yes, and I have a comment that I want to make sure I get this up. It's equally as a mother of 2 white daughter-in-laws, you have to be able to have uncomfortable conversations about white people in their presence with our families as well. Yes.
Thank you.
That's very true. So I really do appreciate you ladies for being here. This was a good conversation. And I'm going to put the name of the book up again because it is important for people to go and grab it, because as I said, we only scratched the surface of the things that, that are talked about. Like we didn't get into some of the things about the ways that we learn in education and, just all of the different things that you talk about and the different experiences. You may not be able to see it, but I got a lot of Billy. You can see that. I got a little speed turned down. So I had a lot of stuff, but I knew we wouldn't get through everything. But I feel like we gave people a good overview of what to expect. So if you all could hold on for me for just a second, don't hang up just yet. But I want to go ahead and announce next week, the next couple of weeks' books, and then let everyone else go. So hold on, I'm gonna take you off screen, but don't hang up just yet.
Okay.
All right. So thank you everyone for joining us for that great conversation, because it is important. We don't exist in a vacuum, and we have to live with everyone and get along with everyone, or at least attempt to. And it's important that when folks can come together and have real conversations, and that the people who have proximity to those who have power can speak truth to power and be able to make sure that they are talking about the things that need to be talked about, and that things can begin to change, because a lot of change has occurred, but things can be so much better as we see things pop up almost daily in the news, where race is still a factor, even though we are in a so-called post-racial society. So thank you to Yseult and Hannah for being here and for writing the book and for their work on Kinswomen, because it's very important. So just by means of what's coming up next week, we are back to the fiction world. We will be talking about Black Candle Women with Diane Marie Brown. I just love the cover of this book. It's a very beautiful book, and I can't wait to have that conversation on next week. And then in 2 weeks, we will have Cade Bentley, who will be here to talk about Where Wild Peaches Grow. So I look forward to seeing you all again for those next 2 conversations, which are going to be great as well. I thank you for your time and look forward to seeing you again here real soon. Thanks again. Have a good one. Bye-bye.